All right, so today's lecture addresses, or this lecture addresses the topic of moral relativism. And this, once again, is under the theme or the rubric of, or the heading of anti-ethics. Let me remind you once again of the significance of the designation anti-ethics. Two things come to mind when we talk about anti-ethics. Number one, these theories that we're looking at, the anti-ethics theories, reject traditional approaches to ethical thought, ethical decision making, standard approaches such as natural law ethics, Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, those kinds of approaches. Anti-ethics, these theories we're talking about reject those approaches as inadequate and insufficient. Secondly, anti-ethics theories that we're talking about generally also conclude that there's no real way for us to establish right or wrong, ethical or unethical, moral or immoral. And so these approaches are very anti-absolutist. They're very anti-absolutist with regard to moral standards that are universal, that apply across the board. So with that having been said, now we're going to turn to probably one of the more prevalent theories that you're familiar with in your life, and that's moral relativism. Your generation is a generation that has really been raised on exposure to moral relativism. And it's the predominant theory of the day. So I think moral relativism really bears a great deal of significance and weight for you in your life today. So let's talk about moral relativism. I'm going to pull up the screen and the slideshow that addresses moral relativism, and back this up, do this. All right, moral relativism. First of all, there's the question of moral absolutes that needs to be clarified from the get-go as we talk about moral relativism. Now, what is intended by moral absolutes? Moral absolutes are those absolutes which individuals say apply generally. They apply across the board, regardless of who an individual is, regardless of when they live or where they live. These are moral absolutes that are to be obeyed regardless. Moral absolutes are based upon an objective standard of morality. For example, with regard to moral absolutes, those individuals who would say, for example, that the 10 Commandments are to be obeyed by all people of all ages, in all cultures, and in all societies, that those are a moral code to be applied across the board without compromise. That is an example of moral absolutism. Specifically, for example, take one of those 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal. Those individuals who advocate that the 10 commandments are universally applicable would say that the commandment that says thou shalt not steal is applicable across the board in every culture, in every society, in every situation, in every context. For example, just to use a hypothetical, if you are living in the midst of a famine and you need food desperately, and you know that there is food in the store down the street, and you know that you can go down to the store and that you can break into it and you can get food to sustain you and to sustain your children. Those who are moral absolutists would say, no, that is not morally permissible, because the 10 Commandments as a morally absolute standard say, thou shalt not steal, and that would be stealing. They would argue that there are other alternatives, there are other possibilities that you can pursue without having to resort to the extreme action of stealing. So that's an example of what it means for a moral statement or a moral requirement to be a moral absolute. Now, there are a number of problems with moral absolutes, according to some individuals. I've listed three of those on the slide in front of you. The first of those problems is that those individuals who advocate moral absolutism are frequently accused of being narrow minded. They're frequently being accused of being closed minded. The person who says you should not steal from the store food to feed your children because it is a violation of the Ten Commandments is said by some to be excessively closed minded. They're not looking at the context, they're not looking at the situation or the scenario in which that decision regarding stealing is being made. A second weakness of the approach is a moral absolutism is who's to say what is right and wrong. In other words, the individual who pronounces that something is a moral absolute seems to be, according to some, setting himself or herself up in a position of moral superiority, that they are the ones who have the capacity and the ability to determine what is absolutely right and what is absolutely wrong, and that no one is to violate those standards of absoluteness. A third critique of moral absolutism is that it simply is not realistic, that the fact is that cultural differences do abound. As we look from various cultures to various cultures, these individuals who advance this critique would say that it's obvious that there are variations and moral differences between cultures. For example, in some cultures, polygamy is deemed to be ethically permissible. In other cultures, polygamy is deemed to be ethically impermissible. And those variations are just realities of the world in which we live. So those who advance this critique of moral absolutism would say that moral absolutism is a denial of the reality that there is a diversity of perspective regarding the topic of morality and immorality, ethics, and and right and wrong in our globe. So, in contradistinction to moral absolutism stands the concept of moral relativism. So, now that we've gotten down a bit of what moral absolutism refers to, let's think about moral relativism. A definition of moral relativism is it is a theory asserting that a moral claim is right if the individual believes that is right, or a moral claim is right if the culture believes that the moral claim is right. In this sense, ethical relativism or moral relativism is said to be subjective or subjectivistic, whereas moral absolutism is objectivistic. Moral relativism is subjective in that it bases the determination with regard to whether something is right or wrong upon the individual or upon the culture or upon the society, not based upon some external moral standard like the Ten Commandments, but really, in essence, we're kind of left on our own to determine, and to our context to determine what is right or wrong. Now, I've given you some examples of this. Notice on the slide, therefore, two people with opposite moral evaluations of the same thing can both be right. That's not possible under moral absolutism. One way is right, one way is wrong. But with regard to moral relativism, two people with opposite moral evaluations, not just different moral evaluations, but two people with opposite moral evaluations of the same thing can both be right. Or it can be that neither of those is necessarily wrong. For example, let's just take Abby. Abby might say bombing Nagasaki during World War II was wrong. Sierra might say bombing Nagasaki during World War II was not wrong. And supposedly or assumingly, each of those statements would be followed by a because statement. Bombing Nagasaki was wrong because maybe it devastated multiplied tens of thousands of lives. Then Sierra would say bombing Nagasaki was not wrong because it saved a lot of lives in the long run because it helped to end World War II. Well, moral relativism would say that both of those statements can be right, or that neither of those statements really is wrong. So it's all relative based upon the individual's perspective, based upon the individual's background, based upon the individual's experiences. It's all relative. And that is the opposite of moral absolutism. Moral absolutism says this is absolutely right in all circumstances, and you are to obey it. This is absolutely wrong in all circumstances, and you are not to engage in it. So there's no wiggle room, so to speak, for differences of perspective on a moral issue. Radical relativism, let's talk about that. Radical relativism, all facts are supposed to depend upon what people believe. Now, that's one of the distinctives of relativism and radical relativism, that it is your belief that makes something right, or your belief that makes something wrong. Something is not right or wrong in and of itself, but rather it is your belief that makes something right, your belief that makes something wrong. If you sincerely and adamantly believe something to be right, then it must be right. If you sincerely and adamantly believe something to be wrong, then it must be wrong. The core claim of radical relativism is that nothing is objectively true. There is absolutely no objective truth. That's radical relativism, that everyone determines for himself or herself what is right or wrong. We are free to do our own thing. We determine that which is right or wrong according to our own perspective. Now, this claim can be refuted, and I've put a refutation of it on the screen in front of you. The statement that I posted says, it is easily refuted. Radical relativism is easily refuted by pointing out that the core claim must be presented as objectively true. Now, what is that saying? Look at the core claim. Nothing is objectively true. Well, think about that now, frail creatures of dust. Nothing is objectively true. That yellow statement on the screen in front of you, look at it. Nothing is objectively true. What's wrong with that statement? Think about it. Nothing is objectively true. What's wrong with that statement? I'll tell you what's wrong with that statement. If nothing is objectively true, then how can we know that that statement itself is objectively true? Because the statement is self-refuting. If nothing is objectively true, that statement is not objectively true. So therefore, we cannot depend upon it. So the problem with radical relativism, which says that nothing is objectively true, is that it is self-refuting. It's a self-refuting claim. When it says nothing is objectively true, and it expects us to regard that statement as objectively true, that can't be true because the statement says nothing, including this statement, is objectively true. So this is what's called a self-refuting statement, all right? So that's a major flaw in radical relativism. So let's talk about objectivity. We have objectivity in math. For example, 5 plus 7 equals 12. No matter what you believe, you can believe with all of your heart that 5 plus 7 is 11. That doesn't make any difference. 5 plus 7 is nonetheless objectively 12, and that is true across the board. So in mathematics, we have objective truth. In science, the earth is round, and it was round even when everyone believed that it was flat. Everyone back at a point in time in human history believed that the earth was flat, and they believed it with all of their heart. Colloquially, we say that The folks who believed that thought that if you sailed to the edge of the earth, you would sail off of the earth. They believed that, and it governed their behavior. They believed it with all of their hearts. But despite the extent to which they believed it, was it true? No, it was not true. They believed it sincerely, but it was not actually true. We found out that the earth was actually round. All right. So those are examples of objective truth in math, objective truth in science. Now let's go with regard to objective truth with regard to religion. In religion, someone posits either God exists or God does not exist. If God exists, then God exists regardless of whether anyone believes it. If God does not exist, then God doesn't exist regardless of how sincerely anyone believes it. The point of that illustration is God's existence is not contingent upon the sincerity with which you and I hold the belief that he does or does not exist. Just because I believe with all of my heart that he exists does not require that he exist. Just because I believe with all of my heart that he does not exist does not require that he not exist. So the problem with moral relativism is moral relativism says that if I believe something is right or wrong with all of my heart, then that makes it right or wrong. But that's a problem with regard to mathematics, with regard to science, and with regard to religion. But then the question emerges: is it true with regard to ethics and morality? Vocabulary translation. Let's look at this. Relatives say this: X is true for me, or X is true in my culture. So let's say a relativist would say, well, let's substitute the letter X. Polygamy, having multiple wives, is true for me. Or polygamy is true for my culture. Or monogamy is true for me. Monogamy is true for my culture. So relativists would be subjective in their conclusion with regard to whether or not polygamy was moral or immoral. It would depend upon me and my culture. Yeah. The objectivist would say, I believe X. I believe polygamy is wrong. I believe monogamy is right. I believe child sacrifice is wrong. I believe child sacrifice is right. So that's a perfect example of the difference between what relativists say and what objectivists say. Now, a key objectivist claim on the slide there in front of you is this: what one believes can be false, even if it is true that you believe it. If you believe something with all of your heart, mind, soul, body, and all of your being, the relativist says, well, that makes it true. The objectivist says, not so. That's just not so. What one believes can be false, even though you believe it with all of your heart, and even though you're believing to the point that you're willing to sacrifice your life for it. The fact that you believe it does not necessarily make it true. But relativism says the fact that you actually believe something is right or believe something is wrong makes it true. Once again, to get back to our illustration, if you really believe that polygamy is right, then it must be right. If you really believe that monogamy is right, then it must be right. What makes something right? What makes something wrong? Relativism says your belief, your sincere belief in that activity makes it right or wrong. Objectivism says no, belief has nothing to do with it. So let's look at some examples on the screen, and you may see some of these on the exam. So I would look at these closely and have these in front of you. You tell me if the two people's statements disagree with each other. Some are tricky. Remember, two statements can only disagree if they are about the same thing. So let's look at these. Do they disagree? Columbus says the Earth is 18,000 miles in circumference. Eratosthenes says the Earth is 25,000 miles in circumference. Do they disagree? Yes, they disagree. They disagree. That's a factual matter. The fact of the matter is, the Earth, I believe, is 25,000 miles. You can measure that. You can establish that. You can determine that. Now, with regard to ethical statements, you'll see that there's a problem determining with any degree of finality because assessing an ethical statement is not like assessing the circumference of the Earth, how far it is around, how many miles it is around the Earth. Next, Gilligan says, my car is green. The skipper says, my car is red. Do they disagree? Well, this is an interesting one. My car is green, my car is red. Well, do they disagree? I would say at first glance, yes, they disagree. That's an empirically verifiable difference. Green is different from red. There's no connectedness between green and red. But I know there are some folks in philosophy that would say, well, it depends upon whether or not the person is colorblind or depends upon how do we really know? And there are lots of questions that go with that. But for our purposes in this class, yes, they do disagree. One says the car is green, the other says the car is red. Those are two very different conclusions. Next, Marcia says, I believe that Paris is the capital of Spain. Greg says, I believe that Paris is not the capital of Spain. Do they disagree? Yes, they disagree. Why? Because it's clear they're debating what is the capital of Spain. That can be empirically verified. And so there's a disagreement there. Laverne says the government should make all abortions illegal. Shirley says the government should not make all abortions illegal. So the question is, do they disagree? The government should make, the government should not make. Is there disagreement there? Indeed, there is disagreement there on the role of government, what the government should do and should not do. Jerry says, capital punishment seems unfair to me. Kramer says, capital punishment seems fair to me. Now then, do they disagree? Well, that's a problem because you moved into the realm of something that is not empirically verifiable. There's no way to empirically verify whether or not capital punishment is unfair. Now, you can argue it based upon reason and causation, reason and rationality, but that's a problem. Do they disagree? They disagree, but how do we determine which one is right? That's a real problem. They disagree, but how do we determine which one is right? Next, Homer says homosexuality is immoral. Smithers says homosexuality is not immoral. Do they disagree? Yes, they do disagree. But as to rightness or wrongness, it's hard to determine rightness or wrongness, really, because we cannot verify empirically. Although some would say that you can, if the purpose of is procreation, homosexuality would not give rise to procreation. So therefore, maybe on the basis of natural law, like we talked about, you could say that one is right and one is wrong, but you really can't ultimately know that. You can speculate that, you can theorize that based upon a theory, but you really cannot ultimately know. So while they disagree, there's no way to absolutely establish which one is right and which one is wrong. Archie says, we should force all other people to adopt American values. Edith says, we should be tolerant of other people's values. Boy, now that's a thorny one there. That's a thorny one there. We should force all other people to adopt American values. Next, we should be tolerant of most other people's values. That one's very thorny. Do with that one what you will. Kind of think that one through. Next, lessons learned. If moral claims were just statements of one's beliefs, then disagreements about moral issues would be impossible. Agreement would be equally impossible. People do disagree about morality, so there must be some people say people do disagree about morality, so there must be an objective moral truth about which they disagree, which is an interesting theory. Moral imperialism, the moral imperialist argues that there are objective moral facts and that he knows what these things are, and it's right to impose these things on others. So the moral imperialist says there are objective moral facts that apply to all people. I know what these objective moral facts are, and it's right, perfectly permissible for me to impose these on others. All right. So if our nation, for example, conquered a foreign nation and said, we know that polygamy, we know what is right or wrong, and polygamy is wrong. Therefore, because we know that polygamy is wrong, no one in this culture is to practice polygamy under the authority of the United States. Therefore, that's an example of moral imperialism. Um, Moral imperialism is is really problematic, but many people would say to us, do not equate objectivism and imperialism. Objectivism is different from imperialism. The only way to reject imperialism is to accept moral. Some people would say the only way to reject imperialism is to accept moral objectivism. The relativist can't assert that tolerance is better than intolerance. So really all you need to know from that slide is the definition of moral imperialism, and that objectivism is not necessarily imperialism. Um, the moral relativist says that circumstances matter. Objectivism also accepts that circumstances are relevant to some extent for moral evaluation. Both of these statements might be true. Infanticide is morally unacceptable in Boston. Infanticide is morally acceptable in an Eskimo's environment. However, this is not because the Eskimo believes that it's right. If this is true, it's true because of the nature of the extreme circumstances. So the point is that objectivism would say that what makes these statements right is the circumstances, not the sincerity of belief with which the individual holds to these beliefs. So, in light of that, moral relativism would link the validity of those conclusions to the sincerity with which someone believed it. But objectivism would say, no, the context does dictate some degree of validity to the differences between those two positions. Uh, there is a certain allure to relativism, and your generation has really been immersed in relativism. Uh, the allure of relativism is it lets everybody live their life as they so want to. The allure of relativism is it enables us or allows us to avoid uncomfortable disagreements, and I don't like disagreements. The allure is that it seems as though everyone gets to be right, and there's no reason to criticize others' beliefs. So those are the allures of relativism. But there's a problem that I want to state with regard to relativism, and that is if relativism is correct, if right and wrong varies from context to context based upon or individual to individual, based upon the circumstance, based upon the sincerity of the belief that one, sincerity of the commitment of the belief to which one holds, then there's no reason for us to debate about morality. Because you have your way, I have my way, we both agree to disagree and we move on. So we can't develop any moral thought. We can't engage in any healthy moral dialogue, any healthy moral debate, because what is, and it's just not going to be changed. So that's what I want you to take away from the concept of moral relativism in distinction for moral objectivism. And understand that moral relativism really adheres to the notion that something is right or wrong based upon the sincerity of the belief. Moral objectivism says that certain things are right and wrong universally across the board, and understand the comparison and contrast of those two approaches. So that's moral relativism. I hope that you benefited from this, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you.